think probably like a lot of writers, as a young kid, I looked to books and language to expand a world that seemed unacceptably limited to me, especially as a kid from a small town, northern town. And that's probably how I got my start doing what I do, which is just working with language primarily. And probably when I was working on my undergraduate degree, I had written my whole life. I'd written stories, like 30-page ghost stories in third and fourth grade that wandered everywhere that my teachers had to read, and kept like punk rock lyrics and notebooks and journaled every feeling. And finally, in about the middle of my bachelor's degree, I realized that I thought I was a poet, which I wouldn't have said at that point because of the audacity of that. And then I realized that I wanted to be serious about studying and writing poetry, and I realized that I didn't know any other poets and that I felt very alone. And so I started an open mic because I was also raising my young son and studying and working, and so I had to multitask. I couldn't just go out, and I worked at a jazz club called the Artist Quarter, which I miss horribly, and my boss, Kenny Horst, the owner of the club, said that I could start an open mic on Wednesday nights. It was the slow night of the club. And at first, I remember sitting there and it was just like me and one friend, or me and one friend and my sister. And, so there were a few weeks, maybe months like that. And then there would be one, like a stranger finally came, and then a stranger came and brought a friend, and it started to pick up. And I was hosting the evening, but I was also waiting tables and bartending to make the night viable for the club because they were taking a risk on this night. And slowly people really started to come, and it became packed, and I met a lot of the people who I still think of as really important literary friends and peers, and so that was a big deal. I met, in particular, I met Fred Schmaltz, who he and I started a quarterly series then called St. Paul Calls at the Artist Quarter, which was 3 or 4 local and national writers that we would invite, and then there would be a jazz trio. And I met Sarah Fox, whose 4 editions published my first chapbook in 2002, which later became part of my first book. At some point after getting my bachelor's degree, I worked for a while doing several different things and just being a poet on the side. And it is amazing how many ways a person can give her time away. And so I decided to go get a master's degree to apply to an MFA program. And I did that mostly just as a way to claim the fact that my writing was a priority in my life. And so I went to Vermont College, and my writing grew there quite a great deal, and I met some more people who were very important to me. And my first collection of poems, as I think a lot of people do now, came out of the work I did in that program. A little bit was before. And after my master's degree, I still like to, what I think of myself is a poet, but also as a member of a literary community, and I like to make space. And so I hosted another reading series called the Imaginary Press series, that started in the John Ullman salon, in a hair salon, that invited national poets with maybe a chapbook or a first or second book out to read. And then after that, I co-curated with Matt Mauk at Maeve's Cafe for a year, part of the Maeve sessions that Matt had started. And now every once in a while, I don't host things very often anymore, but I'll do a pop-up something if someone's coming to town, or I started when my husband and I had a studio in the Solar Arts building during Art-A-Whirl, putting a fort in the middle of this gallery space where some poets could be ready to read a poem or three to people as they were mingling and looking at the art. And so it would be a tiny audience of 3 or 4 people listening to 1 or 2 poets for just a short amount of time, and then they could come back out and go look at more art. And that was fun for a number of reasons. First, because it's just more intimate and there's more give and take in that than like the cutoff of like reader and audience, that separation. Sometimes people recited a poem back or told a story about their day. A couple times people sang songs as thanks. That was really amazing. And I think living Northeast, I think of myself as not just a poet now. I write nonfiction as well, and I also look at ways that I collaborate with all of the artists, including my husband, locally. And I guess that's what I do, and that's the story about how I came to it, I think.
Did you do blanket forts as a kid?
Yes, I did. I was a big fort kid. Yeah. I would make forts out of anything.
That seems to be a very powerful tradition. Crosses all kinds of lines.
Yeah, yeah.
And the blanket fort kids are a different sort. They just are.
Okay.
Tell me about this business of finding your town, the North, too narrow.
I don't know that I would say it was the town in particular, because we moved from Bemidji when I was 7. So I didn't know much about the town, but the world that I lived in seemed limited by the dynamics of a family that had some unhealthy rules in place and some unhappiness, and limited by maybe what a burgeoning poet / fort type would think of as just oppressively realistic expectations. So you could escape to anywhere in books, and you could learn new words, or you could teach yourself the sign language alphabet, or find a way to say precisely what you mean, 10 different ways, or go to the prairie, or go to Narnia, or the Shire, or whatever. Like it was just it was limitless in that way. That's what I meant.
And were you writing back then, or was the escape through words by reading?
I was doing both. Definitely always had my nose in a book. A family story is the day that I got my first book with very few pictures in it, which was this version of the New Testament that came out in the 70s called Good News for Modern Man, and it was the New Testament in kind of like 70s contemporary slang, and I just read the whole thing in a few days because somebody finally gave me a book with all words, So, but I was also I was also writing already in grade school, I would say. By third grade, I thought I wanted to be a writer. But I also wanted to be a paleontologist, and I mean, yeah.
Well, same thing.
Yeah, excavating.
Yes, yes.
And, yeah, the other things you want, yeah.
One way people talk about that pressure in Minnesota from family and community is a pressure towards the practical, towards an understandable career that justifies an education and makes some money, and is that the kind of pressure you felt with the conventions and expectations around you?
That was one kind of pressure that I felt, definitely. And I think Mary and I were talking earlier about I teach a lot of freshmen. I teach a lot of undergrads myself right now. I think they feel it as strongly, if not more strongly. Yeah, yeah. And it's not my personality to think about practicality first. So, yeah.
I noticed as your story progressed that you emphasized the ways that you made spaces for other people to perform, and that you use those spaces to bring yourself into contact with stuff that you might otherwise miss. It's an enterprise I'm very fond of. I've done it myself. My son has done it. He hosts an open mic in Brooklyn, or in Queens, I guess, just on the edge of Brooklyn. Okay. Going to that early time, were you already making community, or were you a sort of solitary word person?
As far as having, as far as a word person, very solitary, yeah. I think that was the first impulse, was just that I wanted to find my people, I am a natural introvert, and so I think at that point it was terrifying to me to think about reading my poems in public. I've done it quite a bit now. I still get a little nervous sometimes, but when I first started the open mic, I had to tell myself that if I passed out, that it would just be performance art, like, that's okay. Like, I had to, I don't know, because it was actually quite frightening to say that I was making something and that I wanted to talk to other people about it, and it might be worth talking about with other people. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But I didn't think that I didn't feel like an editor. I didn't feel like someone who could start a magazine. And so my impulse really was to find some fellow writers and some community. And it was also to give something back, because especially later when I was hosting other readings, I felt like people were working, like people were publishing my writing, or people were inviting me to read, and I wanted to give something back as well. I wanted to contribute to the world of literature. So.
Mm-hmm. I know from having gone to readings and from having helped to host them, that readings can sometimes remind one very much of your blanket forts, and other times not at all.
Okay.
They have a lot of different spirits. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it feels like a a family reunion of old friends, and sometimes it feels like a contest or something.
Yeah.
You just have all kinds of feels. And I'm wondering sort of how that's been for you with these spaces. What spaces, what feels or spaces or kind of ways of relating have you liked?
That's such a good question. Because I still find that same thing walking into any space. You never know if it's going to feel inviting and to whom. So one thing I liked about that small poetry fort, like I said, was that there was more give and take. But readings in alternative spaces are lovely. A local poet, Elizabeth Workman, had a launch around Powderhorn Park one year for her first book, where there were poets stationed at different places around the park, and then the audience walked with a jazz band leading the way. That was fantastic. I'm not a big fan of beer, but I think a lot of the readings that are in the breweries are fantastic because people are relaxed and social and feeling like in a less constricted or stuffy atmosphere. Though then what, I'm not sure right now, because I've been to readings in galleries and a lot of places that are supposedly stuffy that can be so warm. I don't know. What have you found? What do you think is the...
Well, the best readings I've ever heard were friends of the Minnesota Literature newsletter. They did a reading once a year, and people had quite a lot of affection for the publication because it was produced at cost, and it was boring to produce. It had no sparkle in itself.
Mm-hmm.
So they kind of went all out, and they were limited to 5 minutes. And that combination of it being people who felt like they were giving back,
Yeah.
and that sense that if you hated someone, you could really count on it ending.
Okay.
Those two things really made it.
Yeah.
For me.
Yeah.
Quite a lot of readers. Those were really important. Important ones for me.
Yeah. Okay. The Great Twin Cities Poetry Read is tonight. That makes me think of that, where different literary presses and groups invite a certain amount of poets from all over the Twin Cities, and it's been up to 30 poets. Mary Austin Speaker hosts it now, and everybody reads one poem, so it goes pretty quickly, but it's like, yeah, you get this lovely just taste of a few voices in our community. It's really fantastic. So I like that. And I was at a reading in Brooklyn last weekend where it turned into this. I was one of the featured readers, but one of the other featured readers couldn't come, and so it turned into the curators asked everyone to bring a poem, and it turned into like a round robin reading, and it was just beautiful. It was more of a conversation, and it was more of a sharing. So I think I agree with you. Those are the things, the labor of love and that lack of competition where it's more of a conversation.
And somehow
make
it sounds like in the thing you produced with your blanket forts, another thing was going on with some kind of an invitation to respond. and an invitation to respond in some other way than just doing another poem.
Yeah.
A certain freedom there.
Yeah. And that is definitely not something that I foresaw or even recommended. It came up naturally, and that I wasn't even the poet in the fort. You know, at times when that happened, it seems like the poets who were there in the space itself created that invitation for dialogue or for for the back and forth giving. Yeah. So I was happy to see that as another outcome of that space. So.
Well, some poets are really powerful magicians.
Agreed.
And they make a space.
Mm-hmm.
They make a mood, and they make a possibility of response.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I think a rather bad one, but sometimes sometimes something quite wonderful.
Sure.
And if you have a couple of those, you talked about language and reading and words being initially a solitary thing. And I wonder if you're interested in talking about it, if you could say anything about kind of word friendships, writing friendships, sort of how that solitary thing turned into relationships with people or moved into relationships with people or interactions with people that you valued.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like there's so many routes, but initially, as I started to find friends in that initial open mic even, then there were those few people who we started a writers group with, and we would share work with each other, and just started dialogue in that way, or a book club, and my writing grew vastly, and I also, I think you work on something. I keep switching to you. I know that I work on something for a long enough time where I feel like it makes sense to me, and I've said it the way that I want to say it, and it will get rejected from a magazine, or I'll show it to someone who doesn't understand it, or and which is different than showing it to someone who will give feedback, if it needs improvement, but also understand if it's something, if it's a piece of writing that sounds like me or that moves them in a certain way. And so finding those people who I could share work with was a big first step to figuring out who I was as a writer, and then just geeking out about whichever book of poems one of us was reading, making sure the other one was reading it, or staying in touch that way. Yeah.
So in the geeking out line, who has kind of emerged for you over the years as the poet you want to want to recommend to other people and go back to? And, are there there's probably a train, but I'm curious what has worked for you.
Yeah, there is a long train, and I'm always afraid that I'll forget everyone. But I think so in high school, I guess I'll try to go that early, or junior high even, it was Khalil Gibran, my sister introduced me to, and then it was E. Cummings, and then it was Charles Bukowski, which is fine, that's okay. And later, and then musicians too, like David Bowie, right, Leonard Cohen, and Patti Smith, and I don't even know, Elvis Costello even. But I think Charles Simic and James Tate, and right now, well, for I don't know how long, Alice Notley, Mary Ruffalo. I'm reading Natalie Diaz right now. Late to the game in that. My Brother Was an Aztec. That book is kicking my butt right now. I could just freeze. Like, there are just so many people who blow my mind. Ray Armentrout, Young Lee. Yeah, I feel like we could just do this. I'd be good at doing this for an hour, maybe.
Well, what has happened to your early fascination with Gibran? Have you completely outgrown that?
I haven't spent as much time. No, but I have not completely outgrown. In fact, I was working on an essay recently where I realized I have to go back and reread because there's a specific phrase and a specific time when it opened something up for me, and that's what I'm writing about in the essay. But it made me realize I need to reread The Prophet and just kind of be with it as an adult, person instead of, it's just been a long time since I've read the book, so yeah.
One of my interviews a while back was a rather prominent guy named Khalil Gibran Muhammad. And the Muhammad part was because he was the grandson of Elijah Muhammad, the founder of Nation of Islam. Mm-hmm. So he had this convergence, and of course his parents had that romanticism married to this other strain in their lives. Well, I'm curious. Some people who come on the show would like to read something of what they have done, have some particular pieces that were helpful in understanding kind of who they are and what they're about a little bit. Do you have anything like that? Would you like to read something?
Well, sure. I mean, I have a couple books with me, but
yeah,
I have them with me. Scott had them very kindly here at Eat My Words Books. What a nice guy. But yeah. I can't. Well, I'll read this one. So the young son that I brought up earlier is a young man now, and when he first moved out of the house, I found it, my identity, to be a little bit at risk because I've been a parent my entire adult life, and so I kept trying to write about my empty nest syndrome, but I kept typing empty next because I guess I hit next. I spell it more than I spell nest. So this poem is called Empty Next Syndrome, and it's a column poem, or I've heard some people call them contrapuntal poems. So I'll read it down and then I'll read it across. Empty Next Syndrome. Then came the day I had to relearn how I can force itness on to an... Oh, I just started reading it across and then I messed myself up. I'm going to start again. Then came the day I had to relearn how to inhabit both my name and my home, for my son had moved out. How well he'd grown. Dwelling in general became more relic-like. I ghosted around different rooms, my body simply housing a former avocation's vacancy. I still had a name, and when I went out, I was called by it, but it sounded wrong for a long time, unnecessary, a battery corroding in an engine or an unexamined belief. How is it useful simply to cart a single personal name around from private to public spaces? How is it maternal or even part of my value system? I can force itness on myself when it is me, a person, a personal person object, incarnate, I could disappear, separated here and united there in multifarious congress. When it judges itself a fully judgeable object, it creates narratives immoderately like charming verdicts, story after story like a cut bud in a vase, the traditional arc subsumed by a fetish for dwelling solely on the denouement. It began with me. It is now nothing. Then came the day I had to relearn how I can force itness on to inhabit both my name and myself when it is me, my home, for my son had moved out. How, when I am a person? Well, he'd grown, a personal person object. Dwelling in general became more incarnate, relic-like. I ghosted around it. I could disappear. Different rooms, my body simply separated here and united, housing a former avocation's vacancy there in multifarious congress. I still had a name, and when I went out, I was called by it, but it sounded wrong for when it considers itself a long time, unnecessary, a battery, a fully judgeable object, corroding in an engine. It creates narratives immoderately like charming verdicts, story after or an unexamined belief. How is it useful? Story, like a cut bud, simply to cart in a vase, the traditional, a single person name around arc subsumed by a fetish from private to public spaces for dwelling solely on the denouement. How is it maternal? It began with me, or even part of it is now my value system, nothing. That's a piece from The Threatened Everything. Should I read one from Quitter too, or?
Well, yes, I'd like to hear more, but can we stay with that one for just a second before moving
Sure.
on to the next? Because I'm curious about how you think about that form. I mean, I've seen these immensely clever things that people do. I mean, I started out with a children's book on a journey, and the thing goes forward, and then you flip it upside down, and it goes backward. It finishes the journey, and there are things that show up on Facebook from time to time, poems that read backwards well.
Yeah.
And I sort of have the kind of awe that I've got for magic tricks and good puzzles for that. And it sounds like this form is a little bit, it's different than those, but it's like those. I'm wondering how you came on it, why you decided that this is the form you wanted to work in, and what it was like to work in it.
Yeah. I love forms, traditional forms and experimental forms, and a modern poet has to invent the form if it's not already there, right, for all of our, each poem that we write. But for this particular poem, in this section, I should say, there's almost a doubling of a personality. The book is called The Threatened Everything, and it's environmental, but it's also just that the devastation of the loss of identity, and then there's some conclusion at the end that resolves better. But there's some of my scariest poems that I've written, I think, are in this book. I don't think that poem is scary, but I wanted to give it a feel of a split in a way, so the form works really well to give it a feel that there are two things happening simultaneously. In the first column, it's a little more narrative and literal, and in the second column, it's more of a description of an internal state. So I wanted them to stand next to each other and then also have the ability to be read together, where it causes that like that dissonance where the sense isn't quite as literal, and you can hear that kind of split in the voice. So that's why I picked. I've only written maybe 2 or 3 other column poems, so it's a form that seems to be needed at certain times and not others. That's for sure.
When you write a poem like that, and I've never tried, I mean, my experiments went in the direction Cummings went, but, never went beyond. And this is like graduate work in Cummings, so to speak. Do you write it? I mean, do you write it do you write each column by itself and then sort of think about how they work together, or how does it come to you?
Yeah. I'm trying to remember exactly. I'm not a speedy poet, so I'm sure I can't. Oh, excuse me. I'm not sure I can say exactly. I'm sure I worked on each part separately, and I knew intuitively that they were speaking to each other somehow. I'm sure I tried several different ways of putting them together, and on the page they're a little like this too, where there are more spaces sometimes in one than the other, to kind of fit them together in the voice, and make them feel a little more eloping. So I'm sure it was just experimenting over several days at the desk, or weeks or months. Yeah.
How big are the surprises that your poems give you? I'm just asking because I remember talking to a painter once who was doing a picture of his girlfriend, on the couch, and between them, he was sort of off camera, kind of, but he was located. There was a chessboard, and she was lying there in a rather aggressive pose, actually. But the chessboard was like there was a piece entirely, that was set out for the whites, and a piece that was set out for the blacks. And it was very clear, he said in retrospect, that they couldn't work. Everything about the painting screamed, this can't work.
Sure.
And but he didn't know that at the time. So I'm wondering, when you're putting things together and they have this potential to match up in strange ways, how the surprises happen for you.
Okay. Well, I've had that experience with a poem before, in a chapbook that came out in 2009. I thought I had written a love poem to someone a couple years earlier, and rereading it after a breakup, it was clearly a breakup poem. Yes, sometimes my poems know things that I don't know for sure. And also, it's interesting because I don't know if it's interesting, but when I sit down to write, I never write the thing I think I'm going to write, which is frustrating and sometimes a great surprise. I'm working on a kind of a lyric memoir, using hybrid texts, a little poetry, and some documents and some prose, and it's been interesting to learn about myself and my process in just how I subvert what I think I want to do all the time. And that's the reason I'm on my 9th year of working on this project with plain books of poetry, books of more traditional poetry. can have those surprises and still turn into a cohesive collection. But trying to write this focused topic is not in my wheelhouse. But which is why I love it. I'm hoping to finish it this year, but that's a surprise, is learning how frustrating I am to myself.
Yeah.
But I do like it. I like that the poems have a wisdom that I don't have, or the work has a wisdom that I don't have, and I think that's part of the way that I grow as a person.
Yes. There's somebody who said that, who has had this fantasy of trying to erase a line, and the line, yelled at him, "No, I will not be erased. I will stand here forever as testimony to the fact that you are a lousy writer."
Oh.
I forget where that came from. It's something fairly famous, but I didn't. It's not.
Yeah.
My question, I guess one of the Sister Wendy says about paintings that they'll sometimes teach us things we don't want to know.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if is there fear involved in writing for you? I mean, is there a sense that you may discover that the relationship you thought you were just pushing a little further with the poem was really at its end?
Yeah, so the question is there fear in writing? Totally.
Yeah.
Yes.
How's that look?
I find it very frustrating not to be kind of boundless and limitless, which is something that I don't just brush up against in writing, but so I'm afraid all the time that I'm not up to a new task, and finding the ways to overcome that challenge are interesting. And if I grow as a person, I guess through writing, there's some pain that comes with that, and that can be scary, but transformative as well. And so it seems a worthy trade-off for the fear.
Mm. You had something else that you were interested in writing, or reading, another poem.
Oh, sure.
Could we move to that?
I'm trying to... Well, I guess I'll read this one. There's a lot of music in this book, and there are a lot of labyrinths in this book as well. But I think I'm going to read this poem called "Resident." Every news article about every new tragedy employed the phrase failure on many levels. I took up residence in that dismissal. I took up residence in the pain body. I took up residence in the taking body. I revolved for several revolutions. I became revolting. Is there nothing to do with my anger but make more signs, sign more petitions? I took up residence in the epiphany body. Aha! I turnstiled in the pleasure body. Would you like living any place special? Asked my husband, and I took up residence in the fishing lure of his question. This was not for him a satisfying answer. Almost everywhere I projected the same not myself residing. I took up residence in the giving away body until it was gone, gone, gone. Practically nobody seemed especially assisted, and I was almost a memory, so I made up a mantra. The noise, it was the noise, my mantra. And no matter how much we trust or distrust the word love, and in spite of any, impending sense of doom, there will always be hairdos and there will always be the bald moon. I wanted to be but was not a revolution. We wanted to be but were not a revolution. they wanted to be but were not a revolution. Exhausted by my solo effort resembling so many subdivisions puffed with lukewarm Dunkin' Donuts hubris. And I will believe enough to be enough. And they will draw up contracts. And we will win a lot sometimes. I sported different ego cloaks frequently, forgetting I was visible or site-specific, not just a monsoon of elsewhere, not some mystery authority's charity apprentice. Sometimes I got so far off topic, I was back on topic, and took up residence in the luck. And no matter how carefully we live, a scavenger's laugh will sound through the window into our safety. I took up residence in improvement of my thinking, then worried I was simply brainwashing my brainwashing. And when we finally flee our safety, every moment will feel like an earache. We will seek medicine and find none. Yea, we will roam for an earache era, imagining the scavenger growing gray in our safety, until one day, when we will stumble upon a strange new path which leads straight into the hearts of our people. Relieved, we will lie down there to rest as if leaves fallen gently from trees. I quit saying yes. I quit saying no. I quit saying. The quiet of my quitting pooled around me like a public mirror. Rebels found it rebellious. Bosses dreamed it agreeable. The non-committal sort of recognized themselves. Only the eternal hush itself perhaps felt the real circus in my small tent of not saying. So I nestled more aggressively into a moon silence empire, a Galena in the crystal set radio. It was illuminating. Nobody told me how simple revolution could be. Just a little bit of mirror smashing I instincted, recoiled from, then studied. Our autumn hairdos will release themselves into the earth to begin flowering anew. A broken constellation living place, a studious, fragmentary planet, a resident of the blooming, shattering.
Is there context for that poem that it would make sense to share?
That was a poem that I wrote over a long time. In some ways escalating toward the last year's election, but just in general, that climate. I feel like I was looking for a way to, well, in the way the projects are, I guess, these two books followed each other, where The Threatened Everything, I was basically done writing that book in, I would say, 2013. And that was really like I was talking about, that split, and just the kind of darker place the speaker was in, where Quitter was the speaker was in more of a place where she has more agency and was really looking for a way to engage in a active way with the world. And so Resident, I think, was just that almost labyrinthine way that we look for our path and look for a way to stay engaged with the world without giving up hope.
I know labyrinths. I thought they were very silly for a long time. Mm-hmm. Although I knew that people who I didn't think were silly at all liked them.
Yeah.
And then I encountered the labyrinth at the College of St. Benedict. And it was silly to watch people walk it. There's nothing sillier than watching people walk a labyrinth from above, because it looks like they're just sort of doing this straight. But then when you actually do it, sometimes it's different than it looked. So I'm wondering about your experience with labyrinths.
Yeah. So the first time, so I graduated from St. Kate's. There's a labyrinth there that I hadn't seen in my time on campus, because I never walked that way. And one day I walked that way, and I just saw a woman walking back and forth. The labyrinth was just cut in the grass, so you couldn't see it. And I didn't know what she was doing. And so I was just, being a weird young writer, I just sat by a tree and watched her walk back and forth. I thought, I'll just see how long she's going to do this. I don't know. And she did that for quite a while. And then when she left, I walked over to see that the labyrinth was there. And I became like a slow fascination. So I am a very shy person. So I couldn't even bring myself to walk that labyrinth for a while, and I didn't really know what it was, and I didn't know if it was just a Catholic thing, and so then slowly I did some research, and over the course of many years, it just became a symbol that haunted me. And then as I was, so this nonfiction, this hybrid memoir 10-year thing that I'm working on also has to do with imprisonment and punishment, which is mythologically, one root of a labyrinth. And so I started writing more with that as a central image, and I started walking labyrinths. I seek them out now. Anytime I go on a trip, I'll stop anytime I can. The Labyrinth Society has a great labyrinth locator that you can find them. They're everywhere. There are so many just in the Twin Cities. So that you can start with just a question, and you walk in, and it's a good peripatetic meditation. It's easier than just sitting still for me now, I believe. So it's come to be a symbol that I rely on a great deal.
Now, I only know one, and so just want to ask, are they different?
Mm-hmm. Yep. I don't know if there's there's the traditional one that you see frequently. That's at Chartres Cathedral. I don't know if there's one just like that in town. There probably is, and I just don't know. But there's one at Metro State, right outside the library, and one of your former guests, Michelle Filkins, helped to build that one. There's one by Lake Como that I don't remember who designed it, but it's a unique design to the artist. And there's the one at St. Kate's, but they're just all over. I've walked a couple in Austin, Texas, Eau Claire, Chicago, all over.
And you find that the experience of walking them is markedly different. Does the labyrinth have its own flavor?
I think the labyrinths do, and then also just every day does, and just your mind does every day, and your concerns that day, and everything is always a little bit different. So, yeah. I usually go to the one by Lake Como because it's the most convenient, and that one, I've never had the same experience. So, yeah.
Have you also engaged with mazes?
A little bit. I have a thing I would read to you, but it's in it's in a book that's over there. But I have actually a little as a kid, more so. I liked the puzzle aspect more than the meditative aspect as a kid, you know. So
Yeah. I found I saw a wonderful maze, kind of the grandmother of all mazes, maybe.
mm-hmm.
And I didn't want to have anything to do with it at all. And
Yeah.
it reminded me of the maze in The Shining. You know, I mean, where the walls really are. I mean, the thing about a labyrinth is you can you know, it's entirely an imagined place.
Right.
You can't imagine it being a prison, because in the last analysis you can just step over the little whatever it is and get out.
Yeah.
But a maze you can imagine to be a prison.
Yeah.
So I was struck by the difference between the way I felt about mazes and labyrinths.
There's more trickery in the maze. Yeah. My husband and I went and walked Seaver's Corn Maze last summer, and it was fine. It was, when the corn is 8 to 10 feet tall, we were a little backwards sometimes. But again, I never know what is going to be the thing that holds attention, right? We were more excited. There was a house full of parakeets right next to the entrance, and we were like, the maze was okay, but we ended up just spending a bunch of more time with the birds.
Yeah. Well, that opens something kind of nice. Is there a sort of experience that you're going for these days? I mean, as you do your work, and I mean, is there some place you were saving up to buy an air ticket to, or some kind of thing that you want to find? Or do you just kind of let it come as it comes, experience?
You ask good, hard questions. In my work, not like this is...
Well, I presume that the lines are pretty fuzzy between your work and everything else you do.
Yeah, it is true. Yes. And sometimes I believe I can answer that question with absolute clarity. And right now, the thing that I want to find is whatever heart is missing from this bigger hybrid project that I've been working on for such a long time. Which goes back to your question earlier. There must be something that I'm afraid of saying. There must be some minotaur in there still that I'm avoiding. And it's not my favorite part of writing when I realize that, and I don't know what it is yet. But I think that's where I am right now.